The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace as another seemingly ordinary day began for the royal household. Inside the grand palace walls, security personnel moved with practiced precision, their eyes constantly scanning for any potential threats. Among them was Detective Inspector Marcus Webb, a veteran royal protection officer with 15 years of experience safeguarding the most precious members of the British monarchy. Webb had been assigned to the Cambridge Family Protection Detail for the past 3 years, and in that time he had developed an almost paternal instinct when it came to the safety of Prince William and Catherine's children. Today felt different somehow, though. He couldn't quite put his finger on why. Perhaps it was the unusually high number of staff members moving through the corridors. Or maybe it was the subtle tension he noticed in the air as various household employees went about their duties. Prince George, now 10 years old and showing every sign of the confident future king he was destined to become, had awakened earlier than usual that morning. His governess, Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, a woman in her late 50s with impeccable credentials and a gentle but firm demeanor, noticed the young prince seemed particularly energetic as she helped him prepare for the day ahead. George had always been an active child, curious about everything around him and eager to explore every corner of his royal home. The day's schedule was relatively light by royal standards. Prince George had his morning lessons in the palace schoolroom, followed by a brief outdoor activity session in the private gardens, and then lunch with his mother, the Princess of Wales, who had recently returned from a successful diplomatic tour of several Commonwealth nations. Catherine had been looking forward to this quiet family time, especially after weeks of official engagements that had kept her away from her children more than she preferred. As the morning progressed, various members of the household staff began preparing for what they assumed would be a routine day. The kitchen staff, led by Chef Antoine Dubois, started preparations for lunch, while the housekeeping team ensured every room the royal family might enter was spotless and properly arranged. Security personnel conducted their regular sweeps of the areas where Prince George would be spending his time, checking for anything out of the ordinary. Detective Inspector Webb made his way through the palace corridors, conducting his standard morning security briefing with the other protection officers. The team consisted of 6 highly trained individuals, each with specific areas of responsibility. There was Sergeant Claire Morrison, a former military police officer who specialized in close protection for the younger royals, and Constable David Chen, whose expertise lay in electronic surveillance and communication systems. The morning lessons went smoothly in the palace schoolroom, a beautifully appointed room overlooking the gardens where Prince George received his private education. His tutor, Dr. Margaret Thornton, a respected educator with decades of experience teaching children from prominent families, noticed that George seemed slightly more restless than usual. He kept glancing toward the windows, as if something outside had captured his attention. During a brief break between lessons, Prince George asked if he could have something to drink. This was a completely normal request, and Mrs. Fitzgerald immediately arranged for refreshments to be brought to the schoolroom. The palace had strict protocols regarding food and beverages served to the royal children, with everything prepared under careful supervision and tested for safety before being served. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, a new member of the catering staff was going through their orientation process. Sarah Mitchell, a 25-year-old woman who had recently been hired as a junior kitchen assistant, was being shown the ropes by the head of catering services. Sarah had impressive credentials and excellent references, having worked at several high-end establishments in London before applying for the prestigious position at Kensington Palace. What the palace security team didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell was not who she claimed to be. Her real name was Sandra Mills, and she had spent months carefully crafting a false identity to gain access to the royal household. Her motivations were complex and deeply personal, rooted in a twisted sense of revenge against the monarchy that had developed over years of financial hardship and personal disappointment that she blamed on the royal family's policies and public statements. Sandra had been meticulously planning her infiltration for over a year, studying the palace's routines, learning about the staff hierarchy, and identifying potential weaknesses in the security protocols. She had undergone extensive background checks, but her false identity was sophisticated enough to pass the initial screening process. Her plan was not to cause immediate harm, but rather to gradually gain access to more sensitive areas of the palace and potentially compromise the royal family's safety in ways that would embarrass the security services and damage the monarchy's reputation. As the morning continued, Sandra was assigned to help prepare beverages for various members of the royal household. She had been given a detailed list of preferences for each family member, including Prince George's favorite drinks and snacks. The head of catering, Mr. Robert Henley, explained the importance of following exact specifications and maintaining the highest standards of hygiene and safety. Detective Inspector Webb was conducting a routine patrol when he noticed something that triggered his professional instincts. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when something was amiss, a skill that had served him well throughout his career in law enforcement. As he passed by the kitchen area, he caught a glimpse of the new staff member, and something about her behavior struck him as slightly off. It wasn't anything he could articulate immediately, just a subtle wrongness in the way she moved, or perhaps the manner in which she avoided making direct eye contact with the other staff members. Webb had learned to trust these intuitive feelings, knowing that they often led to important discoveries. He made a mental note to keep an eye on the new employee and perhaps run an additional background check when he had the opportunity. In the schoolroom, Prince George had finished his morning lessons and was preparing to move to the garden area for his outdoor activity time. Mrs. Fitzgerald was organizing his materials when a palace servant arrived with a tray containing a selection of beverages, including what appeared to be Prince George's preferred fruit juice in an elegant crystal glass. The servant, a long-time palace employee named Thomas Wright, set the tray down on the small table near the window where Prince George often enjoyed his refreshments while looking out at the gardens. Thomas had been working at the palace for over 8 years and was known for his reliability and discretion. He had no idea that the beverage he was serving had been prepared by someone with malicious intent. Prince George, thirsty after his morning of lessons and eager to refresh himself before heading outside, immediately reached for the glass of juice. The crystal tumbler felt cool in his hand, and the amber-colored liquid inside looked exactly like his usual morning drink. He was mere seconds away from taking his first sip when Detective Inspector Webb entered the schoolroom to conduct a routine security check. Webb's timing was purely coincidental, part of his regular patrol route through the areas where the royal children spent their time. However, as he entered the room, his trained eye immediately swept the environment, taking in every detail as he had been taught to do. His gaze fell upon Prince George standing by the window with the glass raised halfway to his lips, and something about the scene triggered every alarm bell in his experienced mind. The glass looked slightly different from the usual service pieces used for the royal children. The liquid inside had an unusual clarity that didn't quite match the typical fruit juice Prince George preferred. Most importantly, Webb noticed a faint, almost imperceptible odor in the air that his training had taught him to recognize as potentially dangerous. Without hesitation, Webb moved swiftly across the room, his hand reaching out to stop Prince George from drinking. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke, not wanting to frighten the young prince but needing to prevent what his instincts told him could be a serious threat to the boy's safety. "Your Highness, please wait just a moment," Detective Inspector Webb said with practiced authority as he gently but firmly took the crystal glass from Prince George's hand. The young prince looked up with surprise, his eyes wide with confusion at the sudden intervention. Webb's years of training had taught him to remain calm in potentially dangerous situations, and he maintained his composure even as his mind raced through the possible implications of what he had just prevented. Mrs. Fitzgerald, who had been organizing lesson materials at the desk, turned quickly at Webb's voice. She immediately sensed the tension in the room, though she couldn't yet understand what had prompted the security officer's sudden action. Her protective instincts toward Prince George kicked in immediately, and she moved closer to the boy, ready to shield him if necessary. Webb held the glass carefully, noting the weight felt slightly different from the usual crystal service pieces used in the palace. His trained nose detected a faint chemical odor that didn't belong with fruit juice. Years of experience in law enforcement and royal protection had taught him to trust these subtle sensory warnings, even when he couldn't immediately identify the specific threat. "Is everything all right, Inspector Webb?" Mrs. Fitzgerald asked, her voice steady despite the growing concern she felt. She had worked with the royal protection team long enough to recognize when something serious was happening, even if the nature of the threat wasn't immediately apparent. Prince George, still confused by the sudden interruption of what should have been a simple refreshment break, looked between the adults with curiosity rather than fear. At 10 years old, he had grown up surrounded by security measures and understood that the protection officers sometimes needed to check things for his safety. However, this felt different from the usual routine security procedures he was accustomed to. Webb quickly activated his radio communication device, speaking in the coded language used by the Royal Protection Team. "Control, this is Webb. I need an immediate response team to the schoolroom, and I want the duty chemist on standby." Possible Code Yellow situation. Code Yellow was the designation for a potential poisoning attempt, one of the most serious threats the protection team trained for. Within minutes, the schoolroom was filled with additional security personnel, all moving with the practiced efficiency that came from years of training and preparation. Sergeant Claire Morrison arrived first, immediately positioning herself between Prince George and any potential threat, while Constable David Chen began setting up preliminary testing equipment for the suspicious beverage. Dr. Sarah Hamilton, the palace's consulting toxicologist, arrived shortly after the security team. Dr. Hamilton was a brilliant woman in her early 40s, who had been retained by the royal household specifically to deal with situations like this. She had extensive experience in forensic chemistry and had developed specialized protocols for quickly identifying potential threats to the royal family's food and beverage supply. As Dr. Hamilton began her preliminary examination of the liquid, Webb turned his attention to tracing the source of the beverage. His investigation training kicked in automatically as he began asking questions about who had prepared the drink, who had handled it during transport, and what route it had taken from the kitchen to the schoolroom. Thomas Wright, the palace servant who had delivered the tray, was brought in for immediate questioning. The poor man was visibly shaken, realizing that he might have unknowingly delivered something dangerous to Prince George. Thomas had been working at the palace for 8 years without incident, and the thought that he might have been used as an unwitting accomplice in a plot against the royal family was devastating to him. "I prepared the tray exactly as I always do," Thomas explained, his voice trembling slightly. "The beverages were ready in the kitchen when I arrived to collect them. Everything looked normal to me. I had no idea anything might be wrong." Webb could see that Thomas was genuinely distraught and likely innocent of any wrongdoing, but protocol required a thorough investigation of everyone involved in the chain of custody. Meanwhile, Prince George was gently escorted to a secure room where he could wait safely while the investigation proceeded. Mrs. Fitzgerald stayed with him, engaging him in conversation about his morning lessons to keep his mind occupied and prevent him from becoming frightened by the sudden flurry of activity around him. The governess's calm demeanor helped maintain a sense of normalcy for the young prince during what was clearly an abnormal situation. Back in the kitchen, a much more intensive investigation was beginning. Chef Antoine Dubois was cooperating fully with the security team, providing detailed information about who had been involved in preparing beverages that morning. His kitchen operated under strict protocols, with every ingredient carefully sourced and every preparation step documented for exactly this type of situation. It was during this kitchen investigation that Sandra Mills, still operating under her false identity as Sarah Mitchell, began to realize that her plan was unraveling. She had been counting on the beverage being consumed before anyone noticed anything amiss, giving her time to complete her mission and potentially escape before being discovered. The quick action of Detective Inspector Webb had disrupted her timeline completely. Sandra had spent months perfecting her infiltration plan, but she had underestimated the vigilance and training of the royal protection officers. Her background in chemistry, which she had planned to use to create a substance that would cause illness rather than death, had led her to believe she could avoid detection long enough to achieve her goals. She had wanted to embarrass the royal family and the security services, not necessarily to cause permanent harm to Prince George. However, as security personnel began conducting individual interviews with all kitchen staff, Sandra knew her false identity would not withstand the intensive scrutiny that was now being applied. Her forged documents and carefully constructed backstory had been sufficient to pass the initial hiring process, but they would never survive a full security investigation conducted with the resources available to the Royal Protection Team. Dr. Bao Bluss dispatched Hamilton's preliminary tests on the beverage were revealing disturbing results. While she needed more time for complete analysis, her initial findings suggested the presence of a mild sedative compound that could have caused drowsiness, nausea, and disorientation if consumed. The dosage appeared to be calculated to cause significant discomfort without being immediately life-threatening, suggesting the perpetrator's goal was humiliation rather than murder. Detective Inspector Webb was coordinating with other members of the protection team to expand their investigation beyond the immediate palace staff. They were checking recent hiring records, reviewing security camera footage from the past several weeks, and conducting background verification on all personnel who had access to the royal family's food and beverage preparation areas. The investigation was proceeding with military precision, but Webb knew that time was critical. If there was indeed an infiltrator within the palace staff, they needed to identify and apprehend the individual before they could attempt to escape or potentially harm other members of the royal family. The fact that the threat had been directed specifically at Prince George suggested either random targeting or a more sinister plot, aimed at the heir to the throne. As the afternoon wore on, the net was closing around Sandra Mills. Her nervousness was becoming increasingly apparent to the experienced investigators, and her answers to their questions contained subtle inconsistencies that trained professionals were quick to notice. The false identity that had taken her months to construct was beginning to crumble under professional scrutiny. Prince George, still unaware of the full seriousness of what had almost happened to him, was being kept safe and entertained in the secure room. Fitzgerald had been joined by his mother, Catherine, who had been immediately informed of the situation and had rushed back to the palace from her scheduled engagement. The Princess of Wales maintained her composure admirably, but her protective maternal instincts were clearly engaged as she stayed close to her son. The investigation was about to take a dramatic turn as the security team prepared to confront the individual they now suspected of being responsible for the attempted poisoning. The careful work of Detective Inspector Webb and his team was about to pay off, but they knew they needed to proceed carefully to ensure they could gather enough evidence to prosecute the perpetrator while preventing any further attempts at harm. The tension in Kensington Palace had reached a critical point as Detective Inspector Webb and his team prepared to confront Sandra Mills. Dr. Hamilton's more detailed analysis of the beverage had confirmed the presence of a sophisticated sedative compound that would have caused significant medical distress to Prince George. The dosage was precisely calculated, suggesting someone with advanced knowledge of chemistry and pharmacology. Webb approached Sandra in the kitchen staff break room, where she had been asked to wait during the ongoing interviews. His years of interrogation experience had taught him to read body language and facial expressions, and everything about Sandra's demeanor screamed guilt and desperation. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she kept glancing toward the exits as if planning an escape route. "Miss Mitchell," Webb began, using her assumed name while watching carefully for any reaction, "we need to discuss your activities this morning in more detail." Sandra's face went pale at his words, and she seemed to shrink into herself as the reality of her situation became unavoidable. The false confidence she had maintained during her months of planning was crumbling rapidly under the weight of professional investigation. Sandra had spent so much time perfecting her infiltration plan that she had never seriously considered what she would do if caught. Her motivations had been driven more by emotion than logic, fueled by years of personal disappointment and misplaced anger toward the royal family. She had convinced herself that her actions were justified, but now faced with the reality of what she had almost done to an innocent child, doubt began to creep into her mind. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sandra replied, but her voice lacked conviction and Webb could immediately tell she was lying. Her amateur attempt at deception was no match for his professional experience in dealing with criminals and suspects. Every aspect of her behavior, from her defensive posture to her inability to maintain eye contact, confirmed his suspicions about her guilt. Webb signaled to Sergeant Morrison, who had been positioned near the door to prevent any escape attempt. The security team had learned from years of experience that desperate individuals could become dangerous when cornered, and they were taking no chances with someone who had already demonstrated willingness to harm a member of the royal family. "Miss Mitchell, or should I say Miss Mills," Webb said quietly, watching as Sandra's eyes widened in shock at the use of her real name. The security team's investigation had been thorough and efficient, and they had already begun unraveling her false identity through their extensive databases and verification systems. The game was up, and Sandra knew it. Her carefully constructed facade finally collapsed completely as she realized that the Royal Protection Team had discovered her true identity and undoubtedly much more about her background and motivations. The months of planning and preparation had all been for nothing, stopped by the quick thinking and professional vigilance of Detective Inspector Webb. "How did you know?" Sandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The fight had gone out of her completely as she faced the reality of her situation. Webb studied her carefully, still maintaining his professional composure despite feeling a mixture of anger and disgust at what this woman had attempted to do to Prince George. "We're trained to notice things that don't belong," Webb replied simply. "Your behavior this morning, the subtle wrongness about the beverage, the inconsistencies in your background story, it all added up. But more importantly, we take the safety of the royal family very seriously, and we don't take chances when something feels off." As Sandra was formally arrested and read her rights, the investigation team began the process of understanding her full motivations and determining whether she had been acting alone or as part of a larger conspiracy. Her personal history was being thoroughly examined to identify any associates who might have assisted in her plan or who might pose additional threats to the royal family. Meanwhile, Prince George was finally told a simplified version of what had happened. His parents, Prince William and Catherine, had arrived at the palace and were briefing him on the situation in age-appropriate terms. They explained that someone had tried to put something bad in his drink, but that the security officers had protected him, and everything was safe now. The young prince took the news with remarkable maturity, though his parents could see he was processing the implications of what had almost happened to him. At 10 years old, Prince George was old enough to understand that there were people in the world who might want to hurt him because of who he was, but experiencing it firsthand was different from the abstract concept he had been taught about in his security briefings. "Will Inspector Webb be in trouble for stopping me from drinking?" Prince George asked his father, showing concern for the man who had potentially saved his life. This question revealed the kind and thoughtful nature that had been carefully nurtured by his parents despite the extraordinary circumstances of his royal upbringing. Prince William smiled at his son's question, proud of the compassion and consideration George showed even in this difficult situation. "No, George, Inspector Webb did exactly what he was supposed to do. He protected you, and we're very grateful to him for being so alert and quick-thinking." The investigation into Sandra Mills was revealing a complex web of personal grievances and misguided political beliefs that had led to her infiltration attempt. She had suffered significant financial hardship during the economic difficulties of recent years, and had somehow convinced herself that the royal family was responsible for her personal problems. Her plan had been to embarrass the monarchy by demonstrating weaknesses in palace security rather than to cause serious physical harm. However, the security team was not taking her claims of limited malicious intent at face value. The sedative compound she had used could have caused serious medical complications, especially in a child, and her willingness to target Prince George demonstrated a level of dangerous thinking that could not be dismissed lightly. Dr. Hamilton was continuing her analysis of the substance Sandra had used, working to understand exactly how it had been obtained and prepared. The sophistication of the compound suggested either advanced chemistry knowledge or access to professional-grade laboratory equipment, raising questions about whether Sandra had received assistance from others with specialized expertise. The palace security protocols were also being reviewed and updated in response to the incident. While the existing systems had ultimately worked, the threat had been detected and prevented. The fact that an infiltrator had managed to gain access to the food preparation area was a serious concern that needed to be addressed. Sandra Mills was now in custody and facing serious criminal charges related to attempted poisoning and threatening the life of a member of the royal family. Her false identity documents would add additional charges of fraud and identity theft. The legal consequences she was facing would likely result in a lengthy prison sentence, assuming she was found competent to stand trial. The incident had also raised questions about the vetting procedures for palace staff, particularly those with access to food and beverage preparation areas. While background checks had been conducted on Sandra's false identity, the security team was now implementing additional verification measures to prevent similar infiltrations in the future. Detective Inspector Webb was being commended for his quick thinking and professional vigilance that had prevented what could have been a serious incident. His ability to detect subtle signs that something was amiss had potentially saved Prince George from significant harm and had protected the reputation of the Royal Protection Service. As the immediate crisis was resolved, the palace was returning to a more normal routine, but with heightened security awareness. The incident served as a reminder that the threats facing the royal family were real and constantly evolving, requiring continued vigilance and professional excellence from the protection team. Prince George, resilient and adaptable as children often are, was already asking when he could return to his normal schedule of lessons and activities. His parents were carefully balancing their desire to maintain his sense of security and normalcy with the need to ensure his continued safety in light of the recent threat. In the days following Sandra Mills's arrest, the full scope of her infiltration plan began to emerge through intensive questioning and investigation. Counter-terrorism experts from Scotland Yard had been brought in to assist with the interrogation, as the attempt on Prince George's safety was being treated with the utmost seriousness by all law enforcement agencies involved. Sandra's interrogation revealed a disturbing level of planning and preparation that had gone into her scheme. She had spent over 18 months researching palace operations, studying staff schedules, and identifying potential vulnerabilities in the security systems. Her obsession with gaining access to the royal household had consumed her life completely, driving her to abandon her previous career and relationships in pursuit of her misguided revenge fantasy. The investigation team discovered that Sandra had maintained detailed surveillance notes about palace routines, staff movements, and security procedures. Her apartment, when searched by police, was found to contain extensive files of newspaper clippings about the royal family, floor plans of Kensington Palace that she had somehow obtained, and a makeshift chemistry laboratory where she had been experimenting with various compounds. What was particularly chilling to the investigators was the methodical nature of her approach. Sandra had not been acting on impulse or sudden anger, but had carefully planned her infiltration over many months. She had studied the palace's hiring procedures, created false references and work history, and even underwent legitimate catering training to make her application more convincing. Dr. Hamilton's complete analysis of the sedative compound revealed that it was a sophisticated mixture of readily available medications that had been concentrated and combined in a way that would have caused significant medical distress. While Sandra claimed she had only intended to cause temporary illness, the medical experts testified that the dosage could have resulted in respiratory depression, especially dangerous for a child of Prince George's age and weight. The security review conducted in response to the incident led to significant changes in palace protocols. Additional background verification procedures were implemented, including more extensive cross-referencing of identity documents and employment histories. The food and beverage preparation areas were redesigned to include additional monitoring systems and more stringent access controls. Detective Inspector Webb was asked to lead a comprehensive review of all current palace staff, a massive undertaking that involved re-verifying the backgrounds of hundreds of employees. This process, while necessary for security reasons, created significant disruption to palace operations and required bringing in additional personnel to handle the increased workload. Prince George, meanwhile, was showing remarkable resilience in dealing with the aftermath of the incident. His parents had been careful to provide him with honest but age-appropriate information about what had happened, helping him understand that while the threat had been real, the security systems in place had worked exactly as they were designed to protect him. The young prince had asked thoughtful questions about why someone would want to hurt him, leading to serious conversations with his parents about the responsibilities and risks that came with his royal position. Prince William and Catherine were careful to balance honesty about these realities with reassurance about his safety and security. One unexpected consequence of the incident was the way it brought the royal protection team closer together as a unit. The successful prevention of harm to Prince George had validated their training and procedures, but it had also highlighted how quickly a routine day could turn into a life-threatening situation. The team's mutual respect and professional cooperation had been strengthened by working together during the crisis. Thomas Wright, the palace servant who had unknowingly delivered the contaminated beverage, was struggling with feelings of guilt and responsibility despite being completely innocent of any wrongdoing. He had been cleared of any involvement in the plot, but the knowledge that he had almost served something harmful to Prince George was weighing heavily on his mind. The palace administration provided counseling services to help him and other staff members process their emotional responses to the incident. Sandra Mills's motivations continued to be a subject of intense interest for the investigation team and the psychological experts brought in to evaluate her mental state. Her personal history revealed a pattern of disappointment and failure that she had gradually come to blame on external factors rather than taking personal responsibility for her choices and circumstances. She had lost her job during the economic downturn several years earlier and had never been able to find comparable employment. Her savings had been depleted, her relationships had deteriorated, and she had fallen into a cycle of bitterness and resentment that had gradually focused on the royal family as a symbol of everything she felt was wrong with British society. The psychological evaluation suggested that Sandra was not suffering from serious mental illness, but rather from a combination of personality disorders and radical political beliefs that had led her to justify potentially harmful actions as serving a greater purpose. This made her case even more concerning from a security perspective, as it suggested she was rational enough to plan complex operations while being driven by dangerous motivations. The legal proceedings against Sandra were moving forward rapidly, with prosecutors preparing charges that could result in a sentence of 20 years or more in prison. The attempt to harm a member of the royal family was being treated as a form of terrorism, and the sophisticated nature of her infiltration plan was being used to argue for the most serious possible penalties. Media coverage of the incident was being carefully managed by the palace press office, which had to balance public interest in the story with security concerns about revealing too much information about palace protection procedures. The official statement acknowledged that an incident had occurred and that an individual had been arrested, but provided minimal details about the specific nature of the threat or the security measures that had prevented it. The incident had also prompted discussions at the highest levels of government about royal security funding and resources. Home Secretary officials were reviewing the overall security arrangements for all members of the royal family, particularly the younger generation who would be facing these threats for many decades to come. Prince George's return to his normal routine was gradual and carefully monitored. His lessons resumed in the palace schoolroom, but with additional security personnel present and new procedures for verifying all food and beverages before they were served. The young prince adapted to these changes with typical childhood flexibility, though his parents remained vigilant for any signs of lasting emotional impact from the experience. Mrs. Fitzgerald, the governess who had witnessed the incident firsthand, was also receiving support to help her process what she had experienced. As someone responsible for Prince George's daily care and education, she had been particularly affected by the realization of how close he had come to being harmed while under her supervision. The broader implications of Sandra Mills's infiltration attempt were still being analyzed by security experts and government officials. The incident had demonstrated both the effectiveness of the Royal Protection Team's training and vigilance and the persistent and evolving nature of the threats facing the royal family in the modern era. 3 months after the attempted poisoning incident, the effects of Sandra Mills's infiltration attempt were still reverberating through the royal household and the broader security establishment. The trial proceedings had begun, and the detailed evidence presented in court was providing the public with their first comprehensive understanding of how close Prince George had come to serious harm. Sandra Mills had been found competent to stand trial, despite arguments from her defense team that her actions were the result of diminished mental capacity due to personal trauma and financial stress. The prosecution had successfully demonstrated that her planning was too sophisticated and methodical to be the work of someone unable to understand the consequences of their actions. During the trial, the full extent of Sandra's surveillance and planning activities became public knowledge. The jury was shown her detailed notes about palace routines, photographs she had taken of security personnel, and the elaborate timeline she had created for implementing her infiltration plan. The evidence painted a picture of someone who had dedicated enormous time and energy to finding ways to circumvent royal security measures. Detective Inspector Webb was called to testify about his actions on the morning of the incident. His description of the subtle cues that had alerted him to the potential threat became a textbook example of how professional training and experience could combine with intuitive judgment to prevent disasters. Law enforcement training programs across the country began incorporating the case study into their curricula. The testimony from Dr. Hamilton about the sophisticated nature of the sedative compound used by Sandra had been particularly damning. Her expert analysis demonstrated that the substance could have caused serious medical complications, including potential respiratory failure in a child. This evidence effectively countered the defense's attempts to portray the incident as a relatively harmless prank, intended only to embarrass the royal family. Prince George himself had not been required to testify, as the evidence of Sandra's guilt was overwhelming and his young age made court testimony inappropriate. However, victim impact statements from his parents described the lasting effects the incident had on their family's sense of security and their son's understanding of the risks he faced because of his position in the line of succession. The security improvements implemented at Kensington Palace had proven effective, but disruptive to daily operations. The additional verification procedures for staff and suppliers had significantly increased the time required for routine activities, while the enhanced monitoring systems had raised privacy concerns among some long-term employees who felt their every movement was being watched. Chef Antoine Dubois had worked closely with the security team to redesign kitchen procedures, implementing new protocols for ingredient storage, preparation monitoring, and final verification before any food or beverage was served to the royal family. While these measures provided additional safety, they also required significant retraining of kitchen staff and adjustment of operational routines. The psychological impact on palace staff had been more significant than initially anticipated. Many employees had been shocked to learn that someone with malicious intent had been working alongside them for months without detection. Trust relationships that had taken years to build were strained as everyone underwent additional scrutiny and verification procedures. Thomas Wright had eventually overcome his feelings of guilt with the help of counseling services, but the incident had fundamentally changed his approach to his duties. He had become hyper-vigilant about every detail of food and beverage service, often double-checking procedures that had previously been routine. While his increased attention to detail was beneficial from a security standpoint, it also reflected the lasting anxiety the incident had created. Mrs. Fitzgerald had also been affected by the experience, though her professional training and years of experience had helped her maintain her composure throughout the crisis. She had implemented additional safety checks in the schoolroom routine and had become even more protective of Prince George during their daily activities. The trust between the governess and the protection team had deepened as a result of their shared experience during the crisis. Prince George's resilience had been remarkable throughout the entire ordeal. While he understood that someone had tried to hurt him, his confidence in the protection provided by his security team had been reinforced rather than undermined by the incident. If anything, his respect and appreciation for the men and women responsible for his safety had grown significantly. The young prince had written a thank you letter to Detective Inspector Webb, expressing his gratitude in the simple but heartfelt language of a 10-year-old. The letter, which Webb treasured as one of the most meaningful recognition he had ever received, read, "Dear Inspector Webb, thank you for keeping me safe and stopping the bad drink. I know you are always watching out for me, and that makes me feel better. Your friend, George." The broader implications of the case had extended far beyond Kensington Palace. Security services protecting other high-profile individuals and government officials had studied the incident carefully, looking for lessons that could be applied to their own protective operations. The sophisticated nature of Sandra's infiltration had prompted reviews of hiring and verification procedures across multiple organizations. International security agencies had also taken note of the case, particularly the innovative surveillance methods Sandra had used to gather intelligence about palace operations. Counterintelligence experts were analyzing her techniques to develop better methods for detecting similar infiltration attempts in the future. Sandra Mills was ultimately convicted on multiple charges, including attempted poisoning, threatening the life of a member of the royal family, fraud, and identity theft. Her sentence of 22 years in prison reflected the seriousness with which the court viewed her crimes and the potential consequences of her actions. During sentencing, the judge specifically noted that the only thing preventing a much more serious outcome had been the vigilance and professionalism of the Royal Protection Team. The incident had also sparked broader discussions about the security challenges facing the royal family in the modern era. Social media and readily available information had made it easier for individuals with malicious intent to gather intelligence about royal activities and routines. The security experts were constantly adapting their procedures to address these evolving threats. Prince William and Catherine had used the incident as an opportunity to discuss with all their children the importance of security awareness and the reasons why certain precautions were necessary in their lives. These conversations, while difficult, had helped prepare Prince George and his siblings for the realities of their future roles while maintaining their sense of security and normalcy. Detective Inspector Webb had been formally commended for his actions and had been promoted to lead a new specialized unit focused on preventing infiltration attempts against high-value targets. His experience and instincts had proven invaluable, and his colleagues throughout the security services regarded him as a model of professional excellence. The case of Sandra Mills had become a landmark in royal protection history, demonstrating both the persistent nature of modern security threats and the effectiveness of well-trained vigilant protection teams. The incident served as a reminder that the safety of the royal family depended on the constant attention and dedication of the men and women sworn to protect them. As life at Kensington Palace gradually returned to a new normal, the lessons learned from the incident continued to inform security procedures and training programs. The quick thinking and professional excellence that had prevented harm to Prince George had validated the royal protection system while highlighting the ongoing need for vigilance and continuous improvement in the face of evolving threats. The story of how Detective Inspector Webb's alertness and training had prevented a potential tragedy became an inspiration to security professionals worldwide, demonstrating how individual vigilance and institutional preparedness could combine to protect those entrusted to their care. Prince George continued his education and development under the watchful eye of his protection team, secure in the knowledge that dedicated professionals were always working to ensure his safety.